Hello, my name is Sean Spear. I'm the co-director of the ON360 project at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I'm pleased to be here today with Drew Fagan, my partner as co-director of the project and co-author, along with Monk School alumni Luca Gulzik, of a recent paper called Grow Ontario Stronger. We're here today to talk a bit about some of the analysis and insights of the paper. But before we do, I just want to give viewers and followers of the ON360 project a bit of an update on where the project stands in light of the extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in, with a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a level of policy uncertainty that is indeed unprecedented. Viewers will know that the ON360 project is dedicated to evidence-based policy research here in the province of Ontario, with the goal of translating academic policy scholarship into real-world analysis and policy recommendations for public policy makers at Queen's Park. Over the past few years, we've published more than 50 papers covering the full waterfront of issues of interest to Ontario policymakers, from climate change to fiscal policy to innovation to childcare and so on. This year, we are continuing our efforts to bring evidence to bear on the key questions facing the province of Ontario and the long-term goals of jobs, growth, opportunity, and inclusiveness. But this year's program is a bit different than in past years. Due to the extraordinary circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic. And maybe before we get started on our first paper, it's worth giving viewers a bit of an update on what we've been up to since we last connected. First, I'm thrilled to have Drew Fagan join our team as co-director. Drew's been an advisory council member of the ON360 project since it launched in 2018, and it was just terrific to have him come on board as a co-director, bringing his wealth of experience and knowledge as a former public servant in Ontario at the federal level, and of course as a professor of practice now at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. We're so fortunate to have Drew involved. Secondly, since we last connected, we've been conducting consultations with Ontario policymakers, both members of the public service and the political arm of government, to help inform and shape on the ON360 project's research program for the 2020-2021 year. Viewers may know that this is part of our unique modus operandi. The ON360 project is conducting research and analysis on policy issues based on the issues of concern of two Ontario policymakers. That is to say, we're not trying to anticipate or guess what Ontario policymakers are grappling with. We go directly to them, and then, having carried out those consultations, we commission and produce independent evidence-based research on these key questions. And thirdly, of course, the elephant in the room is the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we've decided, as part of our 2020-21 program, to dedicate ON360's overall research program to the question of COVID-19 and post-pandemic planning. Of course, the top priority for Ontario policymakers at the moment is dealing with the immediacy of the pandemic, including the ongoing public health challenges and mitigating the economic effects of policies that have been put in place to manage the pandemic. But of course, the government also needs to keep an eye to the question of post-pandemic recovery. How do we restore economic activity and come out of this process, this experience, more resilient and better placed to advance the goals of jobs and growth, opportunity, inclusivity. And the fact that the government has established a cabinet committee on these very questions is a foundation for the work that we'll be doing over the coming months at the ON360 project. And so viewers can anticipate a range of policy papers covering topics such as post-secondary education, biomedical and health research, dealing with the backlog in our healthcare system that's been precipitated by the pandemic and a range of other critical policy questions. And this first paper that I alluded to earlier, Growing Ontario Stronger, which is co-authored by Drew, Luca Golzek, and myself, is really foundational to that overall program. It aims to situate the current trajectory, the current state of Ontario's economy in an economic trajectory that really predates the pandemic and aims to draw on a wide body of economic analysis and research to begin to set out the contours of a post-pandemic recovery strategy for Ontario. And the purpose of our discussion here today is to give viewers a sense of some of the key findings and insights of the paper, and as I say, begin to lay the groundwork for future papers published by the Ontario 360 project, all with the goal of a ambitious and effective post-pandemic recovery plan for the province of Ontario. With that, Drew, thank you so much. As I said earlier, we're so thrilled to have you even more involved than you have been in the past couple of years with the Ontario 360 project. I know it's a tremendous asset to me as co-director, and I think viewers and readers of Ontario 360 material will see the tremendous contribution that you've already made and no doubt will make in the coming months. Maybe let's just start laying the foundation for Ontario 360's work by drilling into some of the research and analysis in our first paper of the 2021 year. One of the extraordinary things, Drew, that we unearthed as we dug into some of these questions is the extent to which the economic challenges facing the province of Ontario in the current moment are really part of a kind of longer term story. That is to say that for the past 20 years or so, across different parties, different governments, different policy preferences, the province of Ontario has experienced what you might describe as slowed growth. And so, the challenge for the current government is not just to try to restore economic activity after the dramatic consequences of the current recession, but it's to actually get the province on a different economic path than it was on even before the recession. Do you want to just maybe talk a bit about the economic circumstances that the province of Ontario found itself in even before the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Sean. And the statistics really are quite striking. And one that I would cite right off the top is when we think about our competitors, certainly, you might think about other provinces, but primarily given the importance of exports in the American market to Ontario and Canada generally, we think of the states that are adjoining us, the 7 or 8 states on the other side of the border. And what we found is between 1980 and 2020, Ontario has fallen behind. GDP per capita is the measure we used, and it's a blunt instrument, admittedly, because it's the average. And you want to look at the tail at both ends, those at the bottom in terms of income and those at the top. And Ontario may be a fairer society than some of the states we're comparing ourselves to, but we've fallen substantially behind. In 1980, we were about equal with the 7 states that we look at as comparators. Now we're last. And the gap between some of those states and Ontario, New York State in particular, and Ontario is quite substantial, but even Michigan has a higher GDP per capita. Again, we're not saying that the distribution of income in American states necessarily is better. We are saying that, to your point, faster economic growth that would lead to higher GDP per capita would allow a province like Ontario, where regardless of political party, there's an ethos about both competitiveness and fairness to provide greater services for the population broadly. And the reasons for this decline over time, I think are pretty clear, and we cite them in the papers, whether it's in fact weakening export growth, caused by weak productivity growth, weak investment, weak research and development, and a number of other trends. They're really troubling for the Ontario economy, including, the carving out of the manufacturing sector, which happened in the States we talk about, but happened here later, and we're still going through this process. So over time, not only has growth, economic growth slowed substantially. That happened all across Western countries in the United States and Canada from the 1960s, 1980s, the last 20 years. We are growing more slowly than the people we compare ourselves to, and something needs to be done about that.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. Let me just try to unpack it a little bit for viewers who may not think about these things all the time. I think there's a sense that Ontario is a rich and prosperous and dynamic place, and of course that's true. But as you say, Drew, decade over decade, really since the 1960s, average economic growth per decade has fallen steadily. What's striking is between 1960 and 2000, average economic growth per decade was just over 4%. In the 2 decades since 2000, it's been less than 2%. And so, in effect, annual growth has been cut by roughly half on a sustained basis. And that has consequences. Amongst them, as you say, is that our GDP per capita rate had tracked alongside our US neighboring states for some time. And really, since about 1980, they've diverged, so much so that GDP per capita in Ontario now is about $16,000 less than the average of our neighboring states. If you think about that, the $16,000 is a lot of money, and it seems
25 to 30%, right?
Exactly.
25%. It's extraordinary.
And it seems to us that closing that gap ought to be a priority for the Ontario government as it thinks about its post-pandemic recovery plan. Let me ask a follow-up question, Drew. So that's kind of laid the foundation. So growth has been slow. It was stagnating even before the pandemic. We're obviously in a deep hole now, and so coming out of the hole, I think it'll be important not just to be complacent about getting back to where we were before the crisis. We ought to have a stretch goal of trying to close the GDP per capita gap with our neighboring states. Can you just talk, Drew, for a minute about what the literature tells us, the kind of relevant areas of public policy might be for a strategy that has a stretch goal in mind with respect to economic growth, productivity, and ultimately higher rates of GDP per capita?
Yeah, and very simply, Sean, I think it's fair to say that those measures, those areas of focus have expanded greatly. And maybe it's possible, quite possible, that those who thought about public policy, within government, weren't thinking holistically enough about the steps that need to be taken to ensure broad-based economic growth that impacts, that benefits society widely. And, over the last decade or so, last 15 years, concern has grown about inequality at various strata of society. There's also a challenge, by the way, in Ontario, which shouldn't be ignored with regard to regionalism. Mm-hmm. Almost all the job growth over the last 10 years in Ontario has taken place in Toronto and the Toronto area and Ottawa. And that's a huge problem as well. Mm-hmm. But to go back to your question, I think we need to think more broadly about the steps that are taken to boost economic growth and job security. So it's not just about competitiveness and productivity and research and development investment, as fundamental as those are. We need to be thinking about infrastructure investment broadly. Infrastructure investment has accelerated over the last decade, but Western countries, the United States and Canada in particular, really didn't invest in infrastructure for almost a generation. And the impact of that is showing, and we need to accelerate that. But we also have to think about, and this comes to the fore particularly, it's obvious in the wake of the COVID crisis, is childcare. And the fact that we need to think about social supports as being fundamental to economic growth to ensure that people can get back into the workforce in an effective way. So I would cite that in particular, and there are other measures as well that sometimes have seemed to be on the sidelines of economic policy because they're social determinants. And I think we need to think in a much more integrated way if we're going to be able to boost economic growth in the future.
Yeah, it's such an important point that the Ontario government has established a cabinet committee on jobs and recovery. In 1980, the committee's gamut might have been tax policy and regulation and maybe fiscal policy. And I think what the literature tells us and what our paper tries to convey is that a cabinet committee committed to the goals of jobs and economic growth are going to have a much wider gamut of policy concerns than they might have in the past. And that a growth maximizing agenda is going to touch on some of those traditional policy levers like tax and regulation and so on, but some newer ones like infrastructure, childcare, skills training, and so on. And I think one of the things that really comes out in the research, if you draw on work that's been done by economists, by international organizations, and others, that the old way of thinking about the tension between efficiency and equity is less clear than it used to be. And actually, equity advancing policies like childcare, for instance, or child benefits can also be efficiency maximizing. And so, it'd be crucial for Ontario policymakers to think, as you say, holistically about what ultimately is part of the government's overall growth strategy, and all of those elements will be crucial, especially given the kind of headwinds that we were facing even before the pandemic, to say nothing, as you say, of some of the unique peculiarities of the pandemic itself, particularly as it affects women and other vulnerable groups in our economy. Right. Maybe before we leave viewers in this first video with more to come over the coming weeks and months, one of the things we try to do in this first paper, Drew, is to draw on some useful examples from competing jurisdictions of instances where governments have set out frameworks or strategies to root economic growth plans, and with the goal of trying to bring greater coherence, greater accountability, even bringing the kind of public along with them by setting out some milestones or benchmarks to be tested against. Do you want to talk a little bit about why we think one of the things that's lacking on the part of the Ontario government is a framework for thinking and talking about long-term economic growth?
Yeah, and I think there are people who would think, when you talk about a 5-year or 10-year plan, that it's echoing the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And certainly, the commanding heights of public policy over the last 40 years have been to get government out of the way. That's probably a trend that started to decline as the pendulum swung again after the financial crisis of a decade ago, and it's swinging even further now with the expectation that government will play a more substantial role in terms of setting agendas, setting goals, doing it at the right level, not at a super granular level, but thinking again strategically about the jurisdiction and where it can really add value and has comparative advantage against competitors. And I think we were, the three of us were going through the research, struck by the fact that of the 60 states and provinces, at this stage, close to half of them have actually done long-term economic plans that are public at various levels of specificity with regard to sectoral challenges and goals that were set, in some cases GDP per capita, or in some cases growth within particular sectors or export growth. They vary quite a bit, but a strategic plan that had been worked out, the better ones, in broad consultations with the private sector, with the third sector, with all representatives of society and the business community. And Saskatchewan is an example, and that's, I think, fair to say one reason why the agricultural sector, always strong in Saskatchewan, has added heft. We looked at Illinois, and we looked at a number of others. And I think we were really struck by it. Of the 50 states, we counted 23 states that have done this economic planning, which was striking to us, given the fact that the general presumption is Democrat or Republican. The United States, is 10 to 20%, pick a number, more conservative than we are in terms of the balance between government and the private sector. So we were quite struck by that, and in the paper we cite a number of examples of the kind of planning underway, particularly with regard to Saskatchewan and Illinois. And this may be something, as the Ontario government thinks about its post-pandemic planning, that it wants to look at.
Yeah, I think that's a good, a critical point. We anticipate, Drew, a budget from the government of Ontario in the coming weeks.
Yeah.
And I think that budget will need to do two things. One, continue to give people confidence that it has a plan to deal with the immediacy of the public health and economic challenges associated with the pandemic. But secondly, that it starts to give people a sense of what its post-pandemic recovery plan looks like. And, while we don't think the budget is the right place to articulate a long-term growth strategy, that ought to come later, after, as you say, a process of consultation and evidence-based analysis and so on. We do think that such a strategy would be a good way to root post-pandemic recovery planning in the province of Ontario. Not only, as you say, does it permit the kind of consensus building and accountability for the government's agenda, it also enables greater coherence within the government. One of the things that one finds in these various strategy documents that other subnational jurisdictions have released is the extent to which getting at some of the economic competitiveness challenges facing these jurisdictions is the extent to which it requires cooperation within government in crossing multiple ministries and so on. And so having that kind of strategy document rooted in the goal of inclusive growth can help be a kind of blueprint or a roadmap for post-pandemic recovery planning going forward.
And when you think about the very agenda of inclusive growth and the different parameters, traditionally social policy, that we were thinking about now with regard placing at the core of economic competitiveness and growth, it's all the more important, I think, fair to say, that within government, you have really linked up government with the other factors within society, everything from post-secondary education to childcare to all the other factors we're now thinking about, as well as traditional, fiscal and monetary policy. So all the more important now, I think, and I think we were, fair to say, Sean, struck by the number of subnational governments in Canada, and particularly in the United States, who've already taken that step.
Yes. And I guess maybe just as we wrap up, one final point to emphasize. There's within our country, within civil society, a robust debate happening about the priorities for post-pandemic recovery. We've heard case for green recovery. We've heard the case for feminist recoveries and so on. We think at Ontario 360 that kind of debate is robust debate is constructive and valuable and advances the goal of inclusiveness. But the mantra "build back better," in our view, needs to be rooted in a foundation of grow stronger. We started this conversation by talking about the extent to which economic stagnation or slowed growth, maybe to put it more precisely, was part of the challenge Ontario was facing before the pandemic. It only reinforces the point that post-pandemic recovery planning, in our view, based on the research, based on the evidence, the importance of a growth-oriented strategy for post-pandemic planning. And as you say, Drew, that strategy ultimately ought to be rooted in a vision of inclusiveness. And so we hope that this first paper gives people a sense of the issues and challenges that the Ontario government needs to deal with as part of its post-pandemic recovery planning. And we encourage you to stay tuned as we start to roll out new papers that cover the range of issues that will ultimately need to be part of such a plan. And stay tuned to this channel where we'll interview our authors from these various papers. And ultimately, I think the totality of Ontario 360's 2021 program will be a post-pandemic recovery plan for the province of Ontario, rooted in the goal of inclusive growth. And we look forward to the conversation and look forward to you being part of it. Drew, thank you for your contribution to this paper and your contribution over the coming weeks and months.
Thanks, Sean. Pleasure.
Take care.